You've seen it. You say something thoughtful, measured, deep, and the room shifts. Not because you were wrong, but because you weren't simple. And in her eyes, that quiet brilliance of yours, the thing you thought would attract her, suddenly becomes a threat. You weren't arrogant. You weren't cold. You were just aware. And somehow, that's the moment she started pulling away. You noticed it in the silence after your insight. You noticed it in the way she laughed just a little too loudly at the man who interrupted you. You noticed it in the sudden way your clarity became intimidating. And her interest, once curious, began to vanish like smoke. And you told yourself it was a coincidence, that maybe you're just not fun enough, or easy enough, or playful enough. But that's a lie you whispered to yourself to soften the deeper truth. She wasn't scared of you. She was scared of what you represent. Because intelligence, real intelligence, isn't charming. It's dangerous. It sees too much. It asks questions you're not supposed to ask. It breaks the spell. You became the mirror, not the fantasy. And no one, man or woman, wants the illusion shattered when they're not ready to wake up. So you learn to stay silent, to laugh at things that don't amuse you, to nod along even when your soul recoils, to make yourself smaller, duller, more digestible. You buried the sharp edges of your mind beneath layers of approachable, because every time you let it out, you were met with fear, retreat, or ridicule. And so now, you sit with a question that no one taught you how to ask. Why does intelligence isolate you? Why does seeing clearly make them look away? And most of all, why is the very thing that makes you you the one thing they secretly want you to hide? It's easy to believe this is about personality, that maybe you're too much, too intense, too analytical, too emotionally precise. But that's not it. This isn't about your style, it's about your substance. Because what intelligence really brings, beneath the words, beneath the articulation, is presence. Not the kind that performs, not charm, not charisma, but psychological presence. The kind that sees, deeply, quietly, relentlessly. And here's the hidden wound that presence touches. Most people don't want to be seen. They want to be admired, worshipped, desired, idealized. But seen, that's different. To be seen means having your masks peeled back, your contradictions reflected, your unhealed past touched with silent precision. And that's what you do. Not intentionally, not aggressively, but just by being awake in a world that prefers sleep. You notice the subtext, the micro shift in her tone when she talks about her ex, the way her self-image doesn't match her actions, the patterns she repeats and doesn't know why. And to a woman who hasn't confronted her own reflection, you're dangerous. Because intelligence, when it's real, isn't neutral. It disrupts. It disturbs. It forces her to feel exposed without understanding why. And so her instincts respond before her mind catches up. She pulls away, laughs you off, tells her friends you were too deep or overthinking it. But underneath that reaction is a primal need to be safe from being seen. She doesn't want to be deconstructed. She wants to be experienced. And your intelligence, by its nature, starts pulling at the scaffolding she's built around her own identity. And so we arrive at the paradox. She's drawn to your mind, but terrified of what it might expose in her. There was one man who understood this before anyone dared say it. A man who lived in a world of shallow appearances and chose, deliberately, to walk among shadows. His name was Søren Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish philosopher often called the father of existentialism. But he was more than that. He was a man so awake to the inner world that even love, faith, and desire became battlegrounds of perception. And one of his most piercing insights? The crowd is untruth. Kierkegaard knew. Most people don't want the truth. They want agreement. They want comfort. They want illusions that keep the unbearable questions quiet. And anyone who threatens that quiet, anyone who speaks with piercing clarity, will be labeled a threat, especially when that clarity comes from a man. Because a man who sees clearly is a man who cannot be controlled. And Kierkegaard, who walked away from the woman he loved because he feared he would unravel her illusions, knew exactly how dangerous truth could be in love. He once wrote, "People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought which they seldom use. But when you do use it, when you see too much and speak too truly and refuse to perform the expected emotional dance, you become the lightning rod. And to a woman who hasn't yet confronted herself, you become unbearable. Not because you're wrong, but because you're right. Too early. You were told intelligence is attractive, that women long for a man who's thoughtful, articulate, wise. That insight is seductive. That depth is magnetic. That brilliance is an aphrodisiac, and that's the illusion. Because while intelligence may attract attention, admiration, even fantasy, it rarely invites surrender. Not the kind that forms real connection. Not when that intelligence threatens to undo the structures she depends on to feel secure. Let's name the real pattern. Most people, men and women, aren't seeking truth. They're seeking certainty, comfort, emotional symmetry, and intelligence. True, existential intelligence creates dissonance. It sees the cracks in the mask. It questions the origin of every smile. It senses contradiction and speaks to it, sometimes without saying a word. And that's terrifying. Because it doesn't just break the illusion, it implicates the person clinging to it. You become the thing she can't predict, the variable she can't control, the mirror she didn't ask to look into. And here's where it gets darker. Your intelligence isn't just threatening because of what it sees. It's threatening because of what it refuses to do. You don't flatter. You don't bend. You don't mirror back the fantasy she built to survive. You ask, "What are you really afraid of?" And she doesn't have an answer, just a feeling. A sense that you're dangerous, that something about your presence requires a level of honesty she isn't ready for. And so, instinctively, she protects herself. With withdrawal, with dismissal, with an accusation of arrogance or emotional unavailability. But what she's really saying is, "You see me too clearly, and I'm not ready to be seen." At the root of all of this is one brutal truth. Intelligence collapses illusions, and illusions are how most people survive. You thought she was afraid of you, of your mind, of your logic, of your insights. But no, she was afraid of what your presence made impossible, the continuation of her emotional fantasy. See, most relationships aren't built on reality. They're built on roles, on projection, on shared illusions that allow both people to pretend they're something they're not. She plays the prize. You play the pursuer. She offers approval. You offer performance. And when you're intelligent, truly intelligent, you break the script. You ask questions instead of chasing. You stay still instead of reacting. You reflect instead of rescuing. You won't play the part she didn't even realize she was writing for you. And that's terrifying. Because without the script, what remains? Two people, naked, raw, exposed, without masks, without fantasy. And in that space, There's no flattery, no pedestal, no manipulation, just truth. And most people would rather feel loved falsely than seen honestly. So what does she do when faced with a man whose presence says, "I won't play, I won't pretend, I won't dance to avoid discomfort"? She runs, not because you're cruel, but because your mind demands reality, and her nervous system isn't prepared for that level of unfiltered presence. Your intelligence unmasks her, and the moment a woman feels unmasked without consent, she'll label the mirror as the enemy. Not because it lied, but because it told the truth too soon. So you learn to hide it, not all at once, just enough to be liked. You shaved the edge off your sentences, softened your gaze when it got too piercing, bit your tongue when your insight could have pierced the moment wide open. You laughed more, spoke less, nodded along even when your soul wanted to scream, "This is all fake." You made yourself smaller, simpler, easier. You called it compromise, but it was sacrifice. And piece by piece, you traded clarity for connection, truth for approval, brilliance for belonging. You told yourself, maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm too serious. Maybe I just need to be more fun. And in doing so, you cut off the very thing that made you you. Your mind was never the issue. The issue was that you used it honestly, without manipulation, without arrogance, without apology. But the world, especially the romantic world, doesn't always know what to do with an honest man who sees clearly and won't pretend. And so you watched as others, louder, simpler, more palatable, were chosen. Not because they were better, but because they were easier to understand. And still, you waited for someone who would want what you really are. But the longer you waited, the more you questioned whether that person even exists. And here's the quiet tragedy no one talks about. When you dim your intelligence to be accepted, you don't just lose your voice, you lose your self-respect. Because somewhere deep down, you know, you're betraying your mind, and no love is worth that. Let's stop here for a second and ask something no one ever asked you. Have you been hiding? Not physically, not socially, but mentally, spiritually, intellectually. Have you been folding yourself to fit into spaces that can't hold the full shape of who you are? Do you silence your insights to keep her comfortable? Do you water down your curiosity because it makes others feel exposed? Do you shrink your vision so you don't outgrow her affection? Have you mistaken being loved for being seen? Be honest now. When was the last time you said what you really thought? Not what would get you approved. When was the last time you let your mind stretch fully in front of someone? Without performing, without adjusting, without apologizing? Or have you been walking around wearing a mask of acceptable intelligence, just sharp enough to be interesting, but never enough to be feared? You were told to dim your light, to play the game, to keep the peace. But deep down, you know, you weren't made to chase peace. You were made to see. And seeing, truly seeing, has a cost. It makes you lonely. It makes you misunderstood. It makes you feared. And yet, would you really want it any other way? So now you know, you are not too much. You are not the problem. You are not too intense, too deep, or too intimidating. You are simply not pretending. And in a world built on performances, a man who refuses to lie, even with silence, will always feel like a threat. But let that be your signal, not to dim, but to rise. Because when you stay with your truth, when you keep seeing, keep questioning, keep being the mirror, something begins to happen. Yes, some will leave. Yes, some will fear you. Yes, some will try to reduce you to a label just to avoid facing what you reflect. But others, the rare ones, they won't flinch. They'll lean in. They'll see you and stay. Because they've been waiting too. For someone who doesn't need masks to feel safe. For someone who doesn't dance for approval. For someone who refuses to make intelligence a performance. So here's the truth. You don't need to be simple to be loved. You don't need to hide your mind to keep her interest. You don't need to choose between depth and connection. Let the world adjust to your depth, not the other way around. Let them fear you if they must. That fear, it means they feel the weight of your presence. It means you are no longer invisible. And if you ever forget, remember Kierkegaard's whisper in the dark. The crowd is untruth. You were never meant to fit in. You were meant to see, to walk awake. So walk. If this video woke something up in you, share it with a brother who needs to remember what he is, and subscribe to Beneath the Mask. We go deep, we go raw, and we go all the way down. Until next time, stay awake.